By the autumn of 1942, Hitler's armies had swept across Europe and deep into the Soviet Union. But as winter approached, their eastward thrust met its ultimate, bloody test, a city forged in industry, named for a dictator, and destined to become a graveyard. Today, we descend into the inferno. A battle of attrition waged building by building, room by room, where the very foundations of the war would be decided. This was not just a fight for territory, it was a fight for survival itself. This is the turning point of the Eastern Front. This is the Battle of Stalingrad. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, in a city reduced to rubble on the banks of the Volga River, two armies fought each other with a ferocity that defied human comprehension. Soldiers fought for individual buildings, for floors, for rooms, for stairwells. They fought in saws, in cellars, in the twisted wreckage of factories and apartment blocks. They fought in temperatures that froze exposed flesh in minutes. They fought until one side or the other was dead, because surrender was not an option, retreat was forbidden, and victory was the only acceptable outcome. This was Stalingrad, the most brutal, most costly, most decisive battle of the Second World War. A battle that would consume over 2 million soldiers and civilians. A battle that would determine the fate of the Eastern Front and perhaps the outcome of the entire war. This is the story of Stalingrad, where the German Wehrmacht met its doom, and where the Soviet Union began its long, bloody march to Berlin. To understand Stalingrad, we must first understand how the war reached this city on the Volga. In the summer of 1942, Germany launched its second major offensive into the Soviet Union, Operation Blue, designed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus region. Without oil, the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt. Without oil, Stalin's armies would be immobilized. The offensive began well. German forces, led by Army Group South, smashed through Soviet defenses and advanced rapidly across the southern Soviet Union. By late July, German forces were driving toward the Caucasus, toward the city of Baku and its vital oil fields. Victory seemed within reach. But there was another objective that increasingly drew Hitler's attention: Stalingrad. The city, formerly called Tsaritsyn, had been renamed in 1925 to honor Joseph Stalin, who had played a role in its defense during the Russian Civil War. It was an industrial city of approximately 600,000 people, stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, a vital transportation artery connecting central Russia to the Caucasus. Militarily, Stalingrad was significant because it controlled river traffic on the Volga and housed important war industries, tank factories, weapons plants, chemical works. Strategically, its capture would protect the northern flank of German forces advancing into the Caucasus. But beyond the strategic calculations lay something more powerful: symbolism. The city bore Stalin's name. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would be a personal humiliation of his Soviet counterpart, a propaganda victory that would demonstrate the superiority of the German war machine. For Stalin, losing the city that bore his name was absolutely unthinkable, a personal and political catastrophe that could not be tolerated. And so, a city that had been a secondary objective became the focus of both dictators' attention. Both men poured resources into Stalingrad that might have been better used elsewhere. Both refused to accept anything less than total victory. And soldiers on both sides would pay the price for their leaders' obsessions. In August 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, turned toward Stalingrad. Paulus was 52 years old, a career staff officer who had helped plan Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. He was methodical, disciplined, loyal to Hitler, and convinced that his army could take Stalingrad before winter. The Sixth Army was formidable, approximately 270,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. It had fought successfully through the summer offensive, defeating Soviet forces in multiple engagements. Its soldiers were veterans, experienced in the brutal warfare of the Eastern Front. And they advanced towards Stalingrad with confidence that this would be another in a long series of German victories. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched a massive air raid on Stalingrad. Over 600 aircraft, bombers, dive bombers, fighters, attacked the city in waves throughout the day and into the evening. Their objective was not precision strikes on military targets but terror bombing, the deliberate destruction of the city to break civilian morale and create chaos before German ground forces arrived. The raid was devastating. Thousands of bombs fell on Stalingrad's wooden houses, apartment buildings, factories, and streets. Fires erupted across the city, merging into firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. The oil storage tanks on the riverbank were hit, releasing burning oil that flowed into the Volga, turning the river itself into a sea of flame. Approximately 40,000 civilians were killed in that single day of bombing, more than Britain lost in the entire German Blitz. Survivors fled toward the Volga, trying to cross to the eastern bank and safety. But the ferries and boats that might have evacuated them were overwhelmed, sunk, or simply unavailable. Thousands died in the bombing. Thousands more would die in the street fighting that followed. When the bombing finally ended and the fires began to die down, Stalingrad was a moonscape, a wasteland of rubble, twisted steel, and charred wood stretching for miles along the riverbank. The city that had housed 600,000 people was now a ruin. But it would have to be defended nonetheless. Stalin's response to the threat to Stalingrad was characteristically brutal. The city would be held at all costs. The Volga would not be crossed. Surrender was not an option. And to ensure these orders were followed, Stalin issued Order No. 227, the infamous not one step back order. The order established blocking detachments, NKVD security troops positioned behind Soviet lines whose job was to shoot any soldier attempting to retreat without orders. It established penal battalions, Strafbats, where soldiers accused of cowardice or other offenses would be sent to die in suicidal assaults as a form of punishment. And it made clear that commanders who allowed their units to retreat would be arrested and likely executed. The defense of Stalingrad was assigned to General Vasily Zhukov and his 62nd Army. Zhukov was 42 years old, a tough, aggressive commander who had fought in the Russian Civil War and the Spanish Civil War. He understood that conventional defensive tactics would not work in Stalingrad's ruins. The Germans had superior firepower, superior air support, superior armor. Fighting them in open terrain would be suicide. But fighting them in the ruins, where German advantages in armor and air power would be negated, where combat would be at close quarters, where every building could become a fortress, might give the Soviets a chance. Zhukov established his command post on the western bank of the Volga, within artillery range of German positions, to make clear that he would not retreat across the river. And he prepared his army for the kind of fighting that would come to define Stalingrad, Rattenkrieg, the Germans would call it. The Rat War. The German assault on Stalingrad itself began in early September 1942. Paulus's Sixth Army attacked from the west and north, pushing toward the city center and the Volga. The Soviets, outnumbered and outgunned, fought for every street, every building, every pile of rubble. But this was not warfare as the Germans had practiced it for 3 years. This was not the lightning war of maneuver and encirclement that had brought them victory in Poland, France, and the early stages of Barbarossa. This was something different, something for which their training and doctrine had not prepared them. In the ruins of Stalingrad, German advantages largely disappeared. Tanks, which had been decisive weapons in open terrain, became vulnerable death traps in the narrow streets and rubble-choked avenues. A tank could not elevate its gun sufficiently to target upper floors of buildings. It could not maneuver effectively in the debris. And Soviet soldiers, armed with anti-tank rifles, grenades, and Molotov cocktails, could attack tanks from cellars, from upper floors, from soars, from anywhere in the three-dimensional maze of the ruins. German air superiority, which had dominated the battlefield earlier in the campaign, was less effective against defenders sheltering in cellars and bunkers. The Luftwaffe could bomb and strafe, could reduce buildings to rubble, but could not dislodge determined defenders. The fighting in Stalingrad became intensely personal, brutal beyond measure. Soldiers fought with rifles, machine guns, grenades, knives, entrenching tools, bare hands. Combat took place at ranges of meters, sometimes less. Enemies encountered each other in stairwells, in corridors, in rooms separated by thin walls. A grenade thrown through a window. A burst of machine gun fire through a doorway. Bodies piling up in cellars and on stairways, left where they fell because recovering them was impossible. The Soviets called it hugging tactics, staying as close to German positions as possible, sometimes just meters away, so that German artillery and air support could not be used without risking friendly fire. German soldiers found themselves fighting Soviet troops who were literally in the next room, separated by a wall, both sides knowing the other was there, neither able to advance without exposing themselves to point-blank fire. Certain locations in Stalingrad became legendary, fought over with an intensity that seemed insane to anyone not experiencing it. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure near the Volga, was defended by a garrison of approximately 50 Soviet soldiers against repeated German assaults. The fighting lasted for days, the building changing hands multiple times, until finally the Germans brought up flamethrowers and literally burned out the last defenders. Pavlov's house, an apartment building near the city center, was transformed into a fortress by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small garrison of Soviet soldiers. They held it for 58 days against constant German attacks, converting the building into a strongpoint with interlocking fields of fire, reinforced walls, and underground connections to Soviet positions. Pavlov's house became a symbol of Soviet resistance, a single building that the Germans could not capture despite having control of the surrounding area. The fighting reached its climax in the factory district of northern Stalingrad, the tractor factory, the Barricade gun factory, and the Red October steel plant. These massive industrial complexes, with their forests of machinery, their multi-story workshops, their labyrinth of underground tunnels, became the scene of the most intense combat. German forces fought their way into the factories meter by meter, floor by floor. Soviet workers, many of them women and older men, fought alongside soldiers, using weapons produced in the factories they were defending. Tanks rolled off assembly lines and drove directly into combat, sometimes with factory workers still aboard serving as crew. The psychological toll on soldiers of both sides was immense. German soldiers, who had marched victoriously across Europe, who had been taught they were racially superior and destined to win, found themselves trapped in a nightmare they could not escape. Soviet soldiers, fighting for their homeland, for their families, under threat of execution if they retreated, endured losses that would have broken any other army. Snipers became particularly important, and particularly feared, in Stalingrad's ruins. Soviet snipers, often positioned in the upper floors of buildings or in rubble piles with clear sightlines, would pick off German soldiers from hundreds of meters away. The most famous of these was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals who became a legendary marksman, credited with over 200 kills during the battle. Zaitsev's duels with German snipers, particularly the possibly mythical duel with a German sniper named Heinz Thorvald, became the subject of Soviet propaganda and later, Western films. Whether the specific details are accurate remains debated, but the broader truth is undeniable. Snipers on both sides terrorized enemy troops, forcing soldiers to move only at night or under cover, turning every exposed position into potential death. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier newly arrived in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. For officers, it was even shorter, 3 days. Units were fed into the battle, consumed, and replaced by fresh units, which were in turn consumed. The Soviet 62nd Army was essentially destroyed and rebuilt multiple times during the battle. Behind the fighting lay a desperate logistical struggle. The Soviet 62nd Army, fighting on the western bank of the Volga, had to be supplied across the river, under constant German artillery fire and air attack. Ferries and boats crossed the Volga at night, carrying ammunition, food, reinforcements. Many were sunk. Many turned back. But enough got through to keep the 62nd Army fighting. German logistics were paradoxically more difficult despite their apparent advantages. Supplies had to be brought forward through the ruins, under Soviet sniper and artillery fire. Vehicles broke down constantly on the rubble-strewn streets. Horses, still the primary means of moving supplies for the German army, could barely navigate the wreckage. By late October 1942, the Germans had captured approximately 90% of Stalingrad. Soviet forces held only a narrow strip along the Volga, in some places just a few hundred meters deep, and a few isolated pockets in the factory district. German commanders believed final victory was days away. One more push, one more assault, and the 62nd Army would be driven into the Volga. But that final victory never came. Every German attack, no matter how well supported, how powerfully executed, met fanatical resistance. Soviet soldiers fought literally to the death, knowing that retreat meant execution, that surrender was not an option, that the only way out of Stalingrad was victory or death. And as October turned to November, a new factor entered the equation: winter. The temperature began to drop. Snow began to fall. The Volga began to freeze. German soldiers, many still wearing summer uniforms or inadequate winter gear, suffered from frostbite and hypothermia. Their vehicles refused to start in the cold. Their weapons froze. The Soviet soldiers suffered too, but they were more accustomed to the cold, better equipped for it, and more willing to endure it. And they knew that winter was an ally, that it would slow the German advance, sap German strength, create opportunities for counterattack. But German commanders remained focused on the city itself, on the grinding battle in the ruins, on the final push that would drive the Soviets into the Volga. They paid insufficient attention to their flanks, to the long, vulnerable lines stretching back westward from Stalingrad, held not by German troops but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units that were less well-equipped, less experienced, and increasingly demoralized. And in Moscow, in the headquarters of the Soviet High Command, Stalin and his generals were planning something that would transform the battle entirely. Not a defense, not a desperate last stand, but a counteroffensive, a massive, coordinated attack that would encircle the German Sixth Army and turn hunters into hunted. The operation was codenamed Uranus, named after the Greek god who overthrew his father. It was fitting. The Soviet counteroffensive would overthrow German dominance on the Eastern Front, would mark the beginning of the long Soviet advance westward that would end, ultimately, in Berlin. But first, the trap had to be sprung. And the bait was the ruins of Stalingrad itself, where the German Sixth Army remained fixated on capturing the last Soviet positions, oblivious to the disaster approaching from the north and south. Through October and into November, as the street fighting raged in Stalingrad, Soviet forces massed in the steppes to the north and south of the city. Over 1 million men, 13,000 guns, 900 tanks, and 1,100 aircraft, assembled in secrecy, hidden from German reconnaissance, ready to launch the greatest counteroffensive yet attempted on the Eastern Front. The flanks of the German advance were held by Romanian armies, poorly equipped, inadequately trained, stretched thin over long fronts. These would be the targets. Soviet forces would smash through the Romanian positions, then drive toward each other, meeting behind the German Sixth Army, encircling it completely. On the morning of November 19, 1942, as snow fell across the steppes and German soldiers in Stalingrad prepared for another day of brutal street fighting, Soviet artillery opened fire along the northern flank. Thousands of guns, firing simultaneously, targeting Romanian positions. The Operation Uranus had begun. The battle for Stalingrad was about to enter its decisive phase, and the German Sixth Army, which had fought so hard to capture the city, was about to discover it had walked into a trap from which there would be no escape. The Soviet counteroffensive struck with devastating force. Along the northern front, the southwestern front under General Nikolai Vatutin smashed into the Romanian Third Army. Soviet tanks, primarily T-34s, the best medium tank in the world at that time, broke through Romanian defensive positions within hours. Romanian units, lacking adequate anti-tank weapons and already demoralized, collapsed or surrendered. By the end of November 19th, Soviet forces had penetrated 30 miles into the Romanian rear. Simultaneously, on November 20th, the Stalingrad front under General Andrei Yeryomenko attacked from the south, striking the Romanian Fourth Army. The pattern was the same: overwhelming artillery preparation, massed tank attacks, rapid penetration. The Romanian units, brave but outmatched, could not hold. German commanders, receiving reports of the Soviet attacks, initially underestimated their significance. Soviet offensives in the past had achieved local successes but had usually been contained by German counterattacks. This seemed like another such operation, troublesome, certainly, but manageable. But as reports continued to arrive throughout November 20th and 21st, the true scale of the Soviet operation became clear. This was not a local attack. This was a massive, coordinated offensive involving hundreds of thousands of troops, aimed not at pushing the Germans back but at encircling the entire Sixth Army. On November 23, 1942, Soviet spearheads from the northern and southern pincers met at the town of Kalakondon, about 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army, approximately 250,000 men, plus remnants of Romanian units and other forces, was trapped in a pocket centered on Stalingrad, surrounded by Soviet forces, cut off from supply. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In less than 5 days, the German army that had been on the verge of capturing Stalingrad found itself besieged. The hunters had become the hunted. General Paulus, commanding the trapped Sixth Army, immediately requested permission to break out, to abandon Stalingrad, fight through the Soviet encirclement, and retreat to German lines further west. It was the only militarily sensible option. The Sixth Army could not be supplied by the remaining ground routes, all of which were now in Soviet hands. An airlift might sustain the army temporarily, but not indefinitely. And winter was deepening, making the situation more desperate with each passing day. But Hitler refused. Absolutely, categorically refused. The Sixth Army would not retreat. It would hold its positions. Stalingrad would not be abandoned. And Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that he could supply the Sixth Army by air, 300 tons of supplies per day, which was the minimum required to keep the army operational. It was a promise Göring could not keep. The Luftwaffe did not have sufficient transport aircraft. The weather was deteriorating, with snow, fog, and ice making flying extremely dangerous. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns controlled the airspace around Stalingrad. And the surrounded Sixth Army needed not 300 tons per day but closer to 600 tons to maintain full combat effectiveness. In the event, the airlift delivered an average of about 100 tons per day, 1/6 of what was needed. Transport aircraft were shot down by Soviet fighters. Others crashed in the brutal weather. The supplies that did get through were insufficient to feed the troops, let alone provide ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Inside the Kessel, the cauldron, as the Germans called the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Rations were cut, then cut again. Soldiers went hungry, then began to starve. Horses were slaughtered for food. Anything edible was consumed. The wounded could not be evacuated. The airlift was already failing to bring in supplies, let alone take out the growing number of casualties. And the cold was relentless. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius or lower. Frostbite became epidemic. Soldiers froze to death in their positions. Equipment failed. Vehicles wouldn't start. The Sixth Army, even if it had wanted to break out, was increasingly immobilized by cold, hunger, and lack of fuel. But a relief operation was being organized. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most skilled commanders, was given command of Army Group Don and tasked with breaking through the Soviet encirclement and relieving the Sixth Army. The operation, codenamed Winter Storm, would attack from the southwest, fighting through Soviet defensive lines, opening a corridor through which the Sixth Army could either be resupplied or, if necessary, could break out. Manstein assembled a relief force built around the 4th Panzer Army, including some of Germany's best remaining armored formations. The attack began on December 12, 1942, and initially made good progress, advancing toward the Kessel against increasingly stiff Soviet resistance. By December 19, Manstein's forces had advanced to within 30 miles of the 6th Army's positions. At one point, Manstein urged Paulus to begin a breakout operation, to fight his way south toward the relief force, linking up and escaping the encirclement while there was still time. But Paulus refused. Hitler had ordered him to hold Stalingrad. Breaking out would mean abandoning the city, disobeying a direct order from the Führer. And Paulus, a career officer schooled in Prussian military tradition of absolute obedience, could not bring himself to defy Hitler, even when obedience meant the destruction of his army. And so the moment passed. Soviet reinforcements arrived to block Manstein's advance. Soviet attacks elsewhere forced Manstein to divert forces to threatened sectors. The relief operation stalled, then had to be called off. By late December, Manstein's forces were retreating, pursued by Soviet armies. The 6th Army would not be relieved. It would have to endure on its own, or surrender. Hitler's response, characteristically, was to refuse reality. On January 30, 1943, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The message was clear: no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in the field. Paulus was expected to fight to the death, or kill himself, before accepting surrender. But inside the Kessel, the 6th Army was dying. Not fighting and dying, simply dying from starvation, disease, cold, and wounds that could not be treated. Soldiers too weak to fight lay in cellars and bunkers, waiting for the end. Officers faced impossible decisions about distributing non-existent food. Medical personnel worked without supplies, without hope, trying to save men who were already beyond saving. The Soviet forces, sensing the end, launched a final offensive, Operation Ring, to destroy the remaining German forces. Soviet troops pushed into the pocket from all sides, compressing it, fragmenting it into smaller pockets, isolating German units from each other. On January 31, 1943, the day after his promotion to Field Marshal, Paulus surrendered the southern portion of the pocket, including his own headquarters. He sent a final message to Hitler: the 6th Army, true to their oath and conscious of the high importance of their mission, have held their position to the last man. Long live Germany! It was a lie, of course. The 6th Army had not fought to the last man. Paulus had surrendered, along with approximately 91,000 surviving soldiers, the skeletal remnants of an army that had numbered 250,000 men just 2 months earlier. But the surrender allowed Paulus to preserve some fiction of honor. Some claim that his army had done its duty. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days, surrendering on February 2, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The greatest military disaster in German history was complete. Of the approximately 250,000 German and Axis troops trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Most died in Soviet captivity from starvation, disease, or forced labor. The wounded, the sick, the frozen, they died by the thousands in prisoner of war camps that were little better than death camps. And in the ruins of Stalingrad itself, the bodies of soldiers from both sides lay buried under snow and rubble, frozen in the positions where they had fallen, uncounted and unburied. The city had become one vast graveyard. The human cost of Stalingrad defies comprehension. Exact figures remain disputed, but the general scale is undeniable. Axis casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured, exceeded 1 million. The German 6th Army was destroyed. Entire Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions ceased to exist. Soviet casualties were even higher. Estimates range from 1.1 to 1.2 million. The battle consumed armies on a scale unprecedented in human history. But beyond the numbers lay individual tragedies beyond counting. a German soldier who froze to death in a foxhole outside Stalingrad, a Soviet sniper killed by enemy fire, a Romanian conscript who surrendered and died in captivity, a civilian crushed in the bombing of August 1942. Each one a life, a story, a person who mattered to someone, all consumed by the insatiable appetite of this battle. The strategic consequences of Stalingrad were immediate and profound. The destruction of the German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, left a gaping hole in German defenses on the Eastern Front. Other German forces, threatened with encirclement themselves, had to retreat hundreds of miles to avoid the fate of the Sixth Army. The entire German position in the southern Soviet Union collapsed. More fundamentally, Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. For 3 years, German armies had seemed unstoppable. They had crushed Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece. They had advanced deep into the Soviet Union. They had appeared to be on the verge of final victory. Stalingrad ended that illusion. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Germany would launch one more major offensive at Kursk in July 1943, but it would be defeated. After Kursk, the Soviet advance westward would be continuous, relentless, unstoppable. Every battle, every campaign, every mile would bring the Red Army closer to Berlin. The road from Stalingrad to Berlin would take more than 2 years and would cost millions more lives. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Stalingrad marked the point where Germany's defeat became inevitable. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of national resistance and ultimate triumph. The city's defense, the refusal to surrender, the willingness to endure unimaginable suffering rather than accept defeat, embodied the Soviet experience of the Great Patriotic War, as they called it. Soviet propaganda glorified Stalingrad, holding it up as proof that Soviet courage and determination could overcome any enemy. The battle was commemorated in films, books, monuments, and museums. The city itself was rebuilt after the war and became a showcase of Soviet reconstruction. In 1961, it was even renamed Volgograd, Volga City. On February 2, 1943, what remained of the German Sixth Army surrendered. Over 1 million Axis soldiers had been lost, killed, wounded, or captured, along with an equally staggering number of Soviet casualties. The city itself was utterly pulverized. Stalingrad broke the back of the Wehrmacht. It shattered the myth of German invincibility, galvanized the Soviet Union, and irrevocably turned the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. From this moment, Hitler's strategic initiative was lost forever. The battle's legacy is etched in the memory of a nation and in the very soil of a city, a testament to unimaginable human endurance and unfathomable destruction. It was truly a conflict that shaped the modern world. If you want to understand the monumental struggles and the terrible costs that define human conflict, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, do you believe Hitler's refusal to allow a German breakout from the Kessel was the single most disastrous decision of the entire battle? Thanks for watching.